So, if you spent last lesson thinking that the first New Deal was fun, wait till you hear about the second one because it comes and it's a change in direction. As we talked about last lesson, the first New Deal is really about an attempt to reduce business competition in favor of greater cooperation through planning and government guidance. The second New Deal is really a reintroduction of competition, but with regulations about fair play, and it's infinitely more radical than the first. In 1935, FDR pushes through his second round of reforms. Many of the emergency measures of 1933 he tries to make permanent while striking a more, let's just argue, a populist tone, feeding on the populism that fed the progressive era. He overtly attacks big business and the rich. This sort of so-called Second New Deal, of course, with both New Deals, you need to remember that they're not a concrete policy. These are names given mostly after the fact or during the fact that come to sort of encapsulate much of what is past. And what we have here is Roosevelt attacking the way business is done and what is known as the second 100 days. And much of the most important, and very important to note, the longest lasting legislation of the New Deal era comes from this. This is a change in direction. Now, why did the second New Deal happen? Well, firstly, the economy hadn't properly recovered. Unemployment was still quite high. It had reduced somewhat, but it's still hovering around 20% in 1935. In essence, the job wasn't done. Roosevelt also needed to respond to the radical forces that were bubbling up in America, both on the left and the right. He was pretty politically astute. By that I mean he had the ability to sort of read the situation, and he realized that he needed to take the initiative away from radical reformers such as Huey Long, Francis Townsend, or Charles Coughlin. Now, you may be asking yourself, what the heck are these guys and what do they have to do with the whole situation? That's actually coming up. So this will sort of build back into the story and it will make a little bit more sense, so don't worry. He did not want to see millions of voters supporting politicians with extremist views. So in essence, he's trying to save the American system because there is a movement, particularly on the left, but to radically reform America into something resembling a more, let's just say, socialist state. In the midterm congressional elections of 1934, a more radical House had been returned. In other words, the House of Representatives started to shift. They were starting to expect wide-ranging legislative action and were prepared to support it. So, in other words, you have groups like the Farm Labor Party. Okay, this is a group of people who could rely on as possibly as many of 50 supporters in both houses, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate. And they were preparing their own program that would have affected quite radical change, much, much further than Roosevelt ever attempted with the New Deal. For example, they spoke of things like maximum hours work, minimum wages, greater investment in public works, higher taxes for the wealthy, Social Security for all. One of the people leading this Farm Labor Party was a man that we were quite familiar with, named Fighting Bob Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. He seems to rear his head throughout this entirety of this course, and he's proposing incredibly radical things. And he's a man who becomes so, let's say, imbibed with his progressive populist nature that he wasn't prepared to let it go. And in Roosevelt and in the sort of circumstances of the Great Depression, he saw it as an opportunistic time to try and get people to change the nature of the American capitalist system. Roosevelt is starting to become increasingly frustrated as well. We'll get into this again with opposition, but the Supreme Court, you need to know, is beginning to overturn much of his legislation. For instance, they overturned the NRA, and he started to believe that they were opposing him on principle, and this made him more radical, at least in the essence that he wanted to change the structure of how things were done. He also wanted to replace and reintroduce, in many ways, laws that had been struck down by the Supreme Court in new ways that would make them, let's say, more constitutional. A couple other things about the Second New Deal. FDR was also frustrated by the opposition he faced by big business. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce attacked his policies in 1935. He felt that the first New Deal did nothing to help struggling small business. And he really, in essence, tried to set out to rectify this. Policies such as the Public Utility Holding Company Act was aimed at just that. There's another aspect, too. He wanted to balance the budget. One of the interesting things about Roosevelt, as radical as you want to call him, he's not a man who believes in, let's say, deficit spending. He's not a Keynesian in that respect. He's not, he's not labor. In other words, he wants to balance the budget. In May 1935, FDR vetoes a veteran's bonus payment just in order to keep his public finances in order, and he does hold on to that one element of the economic orthodoxy. Here's a timeline of what he does. Yep, timeline. Breathe it in. Moving on. So let's get into what the Second New Deal encapsulates. First, we have the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of April 1935. This is $45.5 billion allocated by the federal government for relief. This is massive. This is the biggest spend in American history to date. That impact of this cannot be understated in that respect. It sets up a Works Progress Administration headed by Harry Hopkins, which, as I'll talk about on the next slide, is incredibly important for the employment of people in public works projects. 20% of the workforce in America, by the time the Second World War starts in 1941, had found employment with the Works Progress Administration at some point. It was a major, major public works spend to sort of talk down, what am I trying to say? To bring down that high unemployment. It should read paid in a more correct English way, and I will change that, but it's a paid a wage that was slightly below market wage. I wouldn't be paid a wage, because if I spelled paid like that, I probably wouldn't qualify for a job in the Works Progress Administration, but I'm sure Mr. Suter wrote this PowerPoint, so anyways, Works Progress Administration, a couple things about it. It wasn't allowed to compete for contracts with public firms or to build private houses. What it did was it built things for the government. If, for instance, it built 1,000 airport runways, it built 8,000 schools and hospitals, and all you have to do is travel around America and see that most of the hospitals have that 1930s aesthetic, and you probably can deduce that this was made by the Works Progress Administration. Things I like to do on my vacation is drive from town to town looking at hospitals, and my wife likes to go to the beach, and that's why there's friction in our marriage. Anyways, it engages in some pretty large-scale projects as well. It builds famously the U.S. Army base at Fort Knox, with the famous Home of Gold. And if you've ever seen a lot of stupid movies, particularly from the mid-90s, when everybody's trying to break into Fort Knox, I believe Rambo defends Fort Knox in one episode. Anyways, whatever. It also sets up the National Youth Administration that encourages education, and it provides part-time jobs for students so they can complete their studies. They all actually, interestingly enough, in order to sort of regulate some of the racial issues, and this is an example of race-laden legislation, the NYA has its own division for Negro affairs. It makes sure that young African American men predominantly are signing up for these types of programs and tries to get them involved. One of the major reasons that African Americans support the Democrats, even to this day, is the legacy of the New Deal. The Democrats start to hoover in, pardon the pun, the the African American vote from the 1930s forward, mostly because Roosevelt is really the first American president who actually passes legislation that is at least race-laden in that respect. Now, let's not overestimate how far he goes, but at least he does something. And for African Americans who've gone from slavery to being ignored to being put into quasi-slavery in the form of the Jim Crow laws, it's a step forward. So, little things. The WPA took on people for 1 year. And only if it didn't compete in the private enterprise. I'm just repeating myself. Anyways, what are some of the issues? Now, when you may think that the WPA is the greatest thing that came up since, I don't know, sliced bread, or I don't know, the fact that they now sell Mexican cheese at Sainsbury's, but since there are some issues. Southern farmers, for example, complained that field hands and domestic servants were hard to find because of the WPA, and as a result, their ability to harvest their crops in time had been hindered, and there is some truth to that. Additionally, conservatives argue that WPA projects are of dubious value, building runways that accept no planes, bridges to nowhere, and all of that type of things, and that little real work was involved, and by real, they define it as, I don't know, things that make conservatives money. Moving forward. Another thing he does is what's known as the REA. It's a Rural Electrification Administration, and you're probably going, "Oh my God, more acronyms." So yeah, there's quite a bit more. So don't get discouraged. Just keep your head down. The REA is formed to build generating plants and power lines in rural areas. As you probably remember, there's a difference between urban America and rural America. And one of the major differences was electrification. Um, in essence, private companies that had provided America's electrical supply, such as General Electric, had found it basically unprofitable. And realistically, it was unprofitable to electrify rural areas. Just not enough consumers for the output and the sort of the not the output, the word I'm looking for. There are not enough consumers to support the investment in electrification. Therefore, rural cooperatives were finding that banks were unwilling to lend to them. So the REA offers loans at low rates of interest for farmers. They're encouraged to form cooperatives to lay on electricity. So, in other words, to build and to provide rural areas with electrical supplies. And it has some pretty large successes, by measure. We see that only 12%, or if you round up, 13% of farms had electricity in 36, but by 1941 that goes up to 35%. And we're talking, in essence, hundreds of thousands of people find that they now have electricity in their home, which is a huge step. We get next to the resettlement industry administration. Rexford Tugwell, you recall him, had ambitious plans to move 500 families from overworked land and resettle them in more promising surrounding areas elsewhere. The whole thing was aimed, in essence, to overcome the Dust Bowls. Um, the resettlement administration failed. Let's just get to brass tacks. It only resettled about 4,500 families. It proved way too costly to move people and families. Not only that, people didn't really want to be moved. They liked it where it was in a weird sense. And the RA began to run into contradiction, if you will, with other New Deal policies, which started to encourage families to stay on the land. And in essence, the REA was a massive failure. You have next the Revenue Wealth Tax Act of 1935. This is an interesting one and a very progressive move. The government sought to raise more revenue for it through the taxation, and it seemed logical to do this by targeting those who could most afford it. So before this act, those earning only $16,000 per year paid an average less than $1,000 in tax. The act massively increased the percentage of tax people had to pay. And of course, it caused a huge uproar. Many of the original proposals were defeated in Congress, such as the federal inheritance tax, which would put a tax on the inheritance that you could leave to your children. That's something we have here in the United Kingdom, but in America, it's sort of considered sacrilege. What it does, though, is it raises the top rate of income tax from 59% to 75%. One of the problems, though, and of course, because it received so much attack in Congress, particularly amongst conservatives on the right, and when the final Revenue Wealth Tax Act is actually passed, there are so many loopholes. And in reality, the raise in taxes raises very little. Really, only $250 million is ever raised by raising the wealth tax on American people. So, in essence, it's sort of a failure. And if you consider that, just think here for a second, the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act spent $45.5 billion. This barely scratches the surface. We next get into what's known as oftentimes as just the Wagner Act, but in its full and real terms, it's known as the Wagner-Connery National Labor Relations Act, passed in July 1935. FDR wasn't a huge advocate for labor rights, but he did not want to upset big business, and he, in essence, by his very nature, distrusted unions. The Wagner-Connery National Labor Relations Act was actually initiated by the Senate. I remember that I had mentioned that many radicals start to come in the midterm elections in 1934, and the radicals remain in Congress into Roosevelt's second term. They are responsible for introducing the act, and this act guarantees workers the rights to collectively bargain through unions of their own choice. Now, in complicated terms, in order to form a union, you need people to sacrifice their ability to negotiate with their employer to a collective. In a country that values individualism, that's me above the group, the idea and concept of unions challenges the very ethos of the United States of America. In reality, though, large corporations find it very, very easy to manipulate, to underpay, and to abuse the little guy. And the only way to get people better pay, better benefits, et cetera, was to, in essence, collectivize, to collectively bargain through a union. Now, in many shops, because of the nature of the American system, they would not recognize unions and refuse to negotiate with them. The Wagner-Connery National Labor Relations Act of 1935 allows workers to A, organize in a union of their choice, and B, forces the recognition of the union on the employer. So if the company's employees forms a union, you must negotiate with them. You can't just say, no, I'm not dealing with these guys and hire new people or go around them. You must negotiate with these guys. What they do as well is they set up a three-man National Labor Relations Board, and this was able to ensure fair play. What that means is that the government, in essence, would ensure that corporations who have abused the system could be punished and forced to work within the system. And this is a massive, massive, massive deal. Okay, talking about changing the nature of the relationship, not only between business and its employees, but between government and getting behind employees. I mean, we're not long ago that in the Pullman car strike of the 1890s, the government allowed the Pinkertons to go in and crush them, or the government used the National Guard to kick people off their lawn. Who were protesting on army pensions. We're now talking about a government that's going to give the rights to millions and millions of workers to collectivize, to improve their work and wages, and the federal government is going to get involved to ensure that these rights are protected. It's a massive step forward. You also have the Public Utility Holding Company Act in August 1935. Holding companies were exploitative. They were part of the trust. This is sort of the idea of creating blind pyramid structure where those at the top who own it sort of hide behind the scenes, working as sort of chairman of the board rather than directors of companies. And as a consequence, they avoid direct ownership, which was illegal, and are able to create huge trusts in corporations. The act effectively brokered the breakup of all companies more than twice removed from the operating company. For instance, some of Samuel Insull's companies were more than 24 times removed from the operating company. All remaining holding companies had to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission so they could be monitored by the government. And the act helped rid the capitalist system of exploitation associated with these companies, which also undermines in many ways. Naturally, of course, this causes massive opposition, big business claiming that government was interfering too much, though the act is upheld by the Supreme Court. It's important to know that it was totally allowed. The next issue, or the next thing we're going to look at, is what's known as the Social Security Act. And again, this is a major step forward in government getting involved in the lives of people. Before the Social Security Act, there was no form of federal unemployment benefit. Okay, Wisconsin, under La Follette, was the only state that provided any form of unemployment benefit. You recall way back, this is part of what's known as the Wisconsin idea. The Social Security Act was the first federal measure of direct help as a worker's right, and it set an important precedent. The act provided for old age pensions to be funded by the employer, and employee contributions to that were mandatory as well, coming directly out of their paychecks, similar to exactly what's done today. You also have state unemployment insurance. This was to be paid by all on payroll, but by payroll taxes levied on both employers and employees. If employers contributed, they would receive a 90% exemption from the payroll tax in which they had to pay. Employers would pass on this cost through higher prices, and employees, as a result, see a reduction in real wages. That is true, but it does create a social safety net, which was incredibly important. However, the Social Security Act had its limitations. Firstly, pensions were paid at a minimum of $10 and a maximum of $85 per month. And this wasn't according to the amount that you had paid into the scheme. And this was, in essence, inadequate to sort of carry a person through their day-to-day existence if they found themselves to be unemployed. They were not to be paid at all until 1940, sort of to give the American system buffer zone to sort of get back on its feet. Therefore, during the Depression, really when it's needed, there's only really 1 year where people are getting the benefits of the Social Security Act. The unemployment benefit um, was a maximum of $18 a week for only 16 weeks. The quote unquote working poor, the agricultural workers, etc., were not included in the act. And anyone holding a part time job as well was not included in the act. One of the things you need to remember about the Great Depression is the unemployment statistics are actually a little bit illusory. In essence, you have 20% of the American population unemployed in 1935, for example, but it's actually many more who had full-time jobs are not included on a list where they may only be working 2 days a week. Additionally, states were able to decide how much to pay poor children. There's a huge variation. $61 a month in Massachusetts versus Mississippi only giving $8. Health insurance isn't included in the act due to opposition from the American Medical Association. That's something that they never necessarily sorted out. The act itself isn't relief. It's in essence reform. It's self-financing. People had to pay into the system. This is not the government just giving people money or helping them get back on their feet. This is people paying into the system so that they have a safety net later on. It's preventing people from overspending, which is why real wages drop. The conservatives, of course, are still massively opposed to this, and in some states, they cut back on other welfare provisions to compensate for the Social Security benefits that they have to pay. But it's important to note, as historian Clement said, the act signified a massive break with the traditional role of the federal government. And this is one of the more important structural things that Roosevelt does. Moving forward, the Banking Act. Although the 1933 Banking Act had helped save the U.S. financial system from collapse, it still left this old system of how banks run completely intact. By 1935, the head of the Federal Reserve Board wanted to increase federal control over the system, and therefore, in 1935, you get Roosevelt passing the Banking Act, which creates a Federal Reserve Board in which the governors are chosen by the President of the Federal Reserve with senatorial advice and consent, which allows government, in essence, to have a say in who is running and regulating the banks. And this is important. One of the problems with the Federal Reserve before was that it just became a place where big businessmen sent or went to do a nice government job and protected the rights of big business. This allows government to step in and say, wait a second here, we need to ensure that the people who regulate the banks are the people who have the banks who don't have the bank's best interests in mind. So in essence, this is a really big important step, the Banking Act, and it creates 12 new Federal Reserve Board branches to monitor banks across the country. So, banks far away from New York, for instance, maybe in California, would have the same level of monitoring of those in the East Coast where the Federal Reserve was headquartered. Let's assess the Second New Deal. Okay. Firstly, let's look at the successes. Number one, massive expansion of the role of the federal government, state government, and local government, thinking of things like the Social Security Act, for instance. The banking system was centralized and much more regulated. Some of the worst excesses of capitalism, such as the colossal power of the holding companies, were addressed, which undermined the communist, socialist rebellion that was bubbling underneath the surface, and in essence took away their ammunition for launching a revolution which would have collapsed the American capitalist system altogether. Labor unions were given a legal voice. The Social Security Act created a national system of benefits, although individual states operated the parts they had control of very differently. There's also the further development of existing policies, the creation of the WPA to aid in both relief and recovery, and the REA helped the process of modernizing the rural areas of the United States. Lastly, let's consider the failures. Number one, the REA only enjoyed limited success. The Revenue Act of 1935 angered people out of all proportion to its actual effects. Therefore, what we need to see is that the first New Deal was relief and recovery, the second New Deal, permanent reform. Let's, next lesson, get into why Roosevelt, I guess, won again in 1936 in the midst of his second New Deal and the problems the problems that were starting to bubble underneath the surface. Ugh, tripping over the finish line there, but that's it.